The spring of 1943 arrived in Amsterdam with a cruel irony. The tulips bloomed as they always had, their vibrant colors painting the fields outside the city in brilliant reds and yellows and purples, as if the earth itself refused to acknowledge the darkness that had settled over the Netherlands. The canals still reflected the narrow gabled houses that lined their banks, those architectural marvels that had stood for centuries, witnesses to commerce and art and now occupation. But the water was darker now, muddy by neglect and the weight of oppression. The bicycles that had once filled the streets in cheerful chaos were fewer, their riders thinner, their faces drawn with the perpetual hunger that had become the defining characteristic of Dutch life under German rule. In the heart of Amsterdam, in a district where the old merchant houses had been converted into administrative buildings and officers' quarters, there stood a restaurant called the Gouden Leeuw, the Golden Lion. It had been, before the war, a modest establishment frequented by local businessmen and families celebrating special occasions. The food had been good, traditional Dutch fare prepared with care, and the atmosphere warm and welcoming. But like everything else in occupied Amsterdam, the Gouden Leeuw had been transformed by the presence of the enemy. Now it served almost exclusively German officers, high-ranking members of the SS and Wehrmacht, who had requisitioned it as their preferred dining establishment. The original owner had been forced to sell at a fraction of its value to a Dutch collaborator who understood that profit could be made by serving the occupiers. It was here that Sophie van der Berg worked, and it was here that she would commit an act that would echo through the resistance networks of the Netherlands for the remainder of the war. Sophie was 27 years old, though the hardships of occupation had etched lines around her eyes that made her appear older in certain lights. She had the kind of beauty that was distinctly Dutch, tall and fair-skinned, with blonde hair that she wore in a simple braid wrapped around her head, and blue eyes that could appear either warm or cold depending on her mood. Before the war, she had been a schoolteacher, passionate about literature and history, engaged to a young doctor named Peter, who had promised her a future filled with books and children and Sunday walks along the canals. But Peter had been arrested in the first year of occupation for treating wounded resistance fighters, and he had died in a German prison camp before Sophie even learned of his arrest. The news had arrived in the form of a terse official letter that offered no details, no apology, no acknowledgement that a life of value had been extinguished. Something had broken in Sophie that day, or perhaps it had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. She had burned her teaching credentials, unable to bear the thought of educating children under a curriculum dictated by the occupiers. She had taken a job at the Gouden Leeuw not because she needed the meager wages, though she did, but because it placed her in direct contact with the enemy. She served them their meals with a smile that never reached her eyes. She poured their wine and cleared their plates and listened to their conversations, absorbing every detail, every careless word spoken in the presence of someone they considered beneath notice. Just a waitress. That's what they called her when they bothered to acknowledge her existence at all. The SS officers who dined at the Gouden Leeuw saw her as part of the furniture, as interchangeable and insignificant as the chairs they sat on or the tablecloths that covered their tables. They spoke freely in front of her, discussing operations and troop movements and the brutal efficiency of their occupation policies. They made crude jokes about the Dutch, about the Jews they were systematically destroying, about the resistance fighters they hunted with methodical cruelty. And Sophie smiled and nodded and refilled their glasses, all while memorizing every word, cataloging every piece of intelligence that might be useful to the people who were fighting back. If you've ever been invisible to someone, treat it as if you didn't matter, as if your presence was so insignificant that they could say anything in front of you without consequence, then you understand the weapon that Sophie carried. And if you want to see how one woman turned that invisibility into the deadliest tool the resistance possessed, then stay with this story. Subscribe now, because what happens next will show you that the most dangerous people are often the ones you never see coming. Sophie had made contact with the resistance 6 months after taking the job at the Gouden Leeuw. It had happened through a customer, a middle-aged man named Henrik, who came to the restaurant occasionally, always alone, always ordering the same meal. He had slipped her a note one evening, hidden beneath his payment, with just 2 words, "We know." She had burned the note immediately, her heart racing, uncertain whether it was a threat or an invitation. But the next time Henrik came, he had been more direct, speaking to her in the kitchen where no one else could hear. "We know you're listening to them," he had said quietly. "We know you understand German. We know what you lost. If you want to help us, if you want to hurt them the way they've hurt you, meet me tomorrow at the Westerkirk. 2 o'clock. Come alone." She had gone, driven by a need for purpose that had been eating at her since Peter's death. Henrik had introduced her to a resistance cell that operated in Amsterdam, a network of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Forging documents, hiding Jews, sabotaging German operations, gathering intelligence. They had been cautious with her at first, testing her commitment, giving her small tasks to prove her reliability. But Sophie had proven herself quickly, passing along intelligence she gathered at the restaurant, information that had led to successful ambushes and sabotage operations. Over time, she had become one of their most valuable assets. The intelligence she provided was consistently accurate and often critical. She had learned to read the Germans, to distinguish between idle conversation and genuine operational discussions. She had developed a system for remembering details, associating information with specific tables or dishes, creating mental maps that allowed her to recall conversations with perfect clarity. And she had learned to control her emotions, to maintain the pleasant, slightly vacant expression of a simple waitress, even when the men she served discussed atrocities that made her want to scream. But intelligence gathering, valuable as it was, had begun to feel insufficient. Sophie wanted to do more than just listen and report. She wanted to strike back, to hurt them in a way that was direct and undeniable. She had begun to think about the possibilities that her position offered, the access she had to their food and drink, the trust they placed in her simply because they couldn't imagine that someone as insignificant as a waitress could pose any threat. The idea had come to her gradually, growing from a dark seed of rage into a fully formed plan. She could poison them. Not all of them. Not all at once. That would be impossible and would certainly lead to immediate retaliation against innocent Dutch civilians. But a targeted operation, carefully planned and executed, could eliminate key personnel while minimizing the risk of discovery and reprisal. It would require patience, preparation, and access to the right materials. Most importantly, it would require an opportunity, a gathering of high-value targets in one place at one time. That opportunity presented itself in March 1943, when Sophie overheard a conversation between two SS officers discussing an upcoming dinner. A new commander was being assigned to oversee security operations in Amsterdam, and a formal dinner was being planned to welcome him and brief the command staff on new directives from Berlin. The dinner would be held at the Goudenloh, of course, and would include approximately 15 high-ranking officers, the entire command structure responsible for the occupation of Amsterdam and the surrounding region. Sophie had felt her pulse quicken as she absorbed the details. This was it. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. 15 officers, all in one room, all eating the same meal. If she could poison that meal, she could decapitate the German command structure in Amsterdam in a single stroke. The chaos and disruption would be enormous. The psychological impact on the occupiers would be devastating. And the message to the Dutch people would be clear. Resistance was possible, the enemy was vulnerable, hope was not lost. But the plan would require resources she didn't have. She needed poison, and not just any poison. Something that would act quickly enough to prevent the officers from leaving the restaurant and seeking medical help, but not so quickly that they would realize what was happening before they had all been served. She needed something that could be disguised in food or drink, that wouldn't be detected by taste or smell. And she needed enough of it to ensure that the dosage would be lethal even if distributed among multiple dishes. She had brought the idea to Henrik at their next meeting, in a safe house in the Jordan district where the resistance cell gathered to plan operations. The room had been crowded with people she had come to know over months, men and women of all ages, from all walks of life, united by their refusal to accept the occupation. She had laid out her plan with clinical precision, explaining the opportunity, the logistics, the potential impact. The reaction had been mixed. Some had been enthusiastic, seeing the operation as a chance to strike a major blow against the enemy. Others had been cautious, worried about the risks and the potential for retaliation. One older woman, a former nurse named Anna, had been openly opposed. They'll kill hundreds in reprisal, Anna had argued, You know how they operate. For every German killed, they execute 10, 20, sometimes 50 Dutch civilians. Are you prepared to have that blood on your hands? Sophie had met her gaze steadily. They're already killing us. Every day. Jews, resistance fighters, anyone who defies them. At least this way, we take some of them with us. At least this way, we show them that we're not defeated. The debate had continued for hours, but eventually a decision had been made. The operation would proceed, but with strict conditions. Sophie would be provided with the poison, but the resistance would simultaneously launch a propaganda campaign to claim responsibility and frame the poisoning as a military operation against legitimate targets, hoping to minimize civilian reprisals. They would also prepare to evacuate key resistance members and their families immediately after the operation, in case the Germans launched a widespread crackdown. The poison had been obtained through a resistance contact who worked in a hospital, a compound called strychnine, derived from the seeds of the Strychnus nux vomica tree. It was a brutal poison, causing violent convulsions and respiratory failure, but had the advantage of being relatively easy to disguise in strongly flavored food or drink. The dosage would need to be carefully calculated, enough to ensure lethality, but not so much that it would be detected by taste. Sophie had spent the next 2 weeks preparing. She had studied the effects of strychnine, learning the symptoms and timeline of poisoning. She had practiced her role, rehearsing the movements and expressions she would need to maintain her cover. She had made arrangements for her mother, who lived in a small apartment in the eastern part of the city, to stay with relatives in the countryside for a few weeks, just in case. And she had steeled herself for what was coming, for the knowledge that she was about to kill 15 men, that she would watch them die, that she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. The dinner was scheduled for a Thursday evening in late March. Sophie had arrived at the Gouden early that day, as she always did, helping with preparations in the kitchen. The restaurant chef, a Dutchman named Martin who had no love for the Germans but needed the job to feed his family, had been told that this was an important dinner and that everything needed to be perfect. He had planned an elaborate menu, a first course of smoked eel with horseradish cream, followed by a soup of spring vegetables, then the main course of roasted venison with red wine sauce and root vegetables, and finally a dessert of apple tart with cream. Sophie had volunteered to prepare the wine sauce for the venison, claiming that she had learned a special recipe from her grandmother. Martin, overwhelmed with the complexity of the meal, had been grateful for the help. She had worked in a corner of the kitchen, carefully following the traditional recipe, reducing red wine with shallots and herbs, adding beef stock and butter, and then, when no one was looking, she had added the strychnine. The poison dissolved completely into the dark, rich sauce, undetectable by sight or smell. The bitter taste would be masked by the wine and the intensity of the other flavors. She had prepared enough sauce for all 15 portions of venison, ensuring that each officer would receive a lethal dose. Her hands had been steady as she worked, her mind calm and focused. There was no room for doubt now, no space for second thoughts. This was war, and she was a soldier, and soldiers did what needed to be done. The officers had begun arriving at 7 o'clock, their staff cars pulling up outside the restaurant, their boots loud on the cobblestones. Sophie had watched from the window as they entered, these men in their immaculate uniforms with their insignia of rank and their casual arrogance. She recognized several of them, regulars of the restaurant who had never bothered to learn her name. The new commander, Standard & Four Klaus Richter, was a tall man in his 40s with cold eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He was accompanied by his staff, including the Gestapo chief for Amsterdam, the head of the security police, and various other officers responsible for machinery of occupation. They had been seated at a long table in the private dining room, a space that had been decorated with flowers and candles to create an atmosphere of celebration. Sophie and 2 other waitresses had been assigned to serve them, moving between the kitchen and the dining room with practiced efficiency. The officers had been in high spirits, drinking heavily, laughing at jokes that Sophie couldn't hear but could imagine. They were celebrating their power, their control, their certainty that they had crushed all meaningful resistance in the Netherlands. The first course had been served without incident. The officers had eaten the smoked eel with appreciation, complimenting the chef. The soup had followed, equally well received. Sophie had moved among them like a ghost, refilling wine glasses, removing plates, her face a mask of pleasant servility. None of them looked at her directly. None of them saw her as anything more than a function, a mechanism for delivering food and drink. Then had come the main course. Sophie had carried the plates from the kitchen, each one bearing a perfectly cooked portion of venison, the meat glistening with the poisoned wine sauce. She had placed them in front of the officers with steady hands, her expression unchanged. She had watched as they picked up their knives and forks, as they cut into the tender meat, as they brought the first bites to their mouths. Standard and for Richter had been the first to eat, taking a large bite and nodding with satisfaction. "Excellent," he had said in German to the officer beside him. "The Dutch may be inferior in every other way, but they do know how to cook game." The others had laughed and begun eating, their conversation continuing, their attention focused on each other and the business they were discussing. Sophie had retreated to the corner of a room, standing with the other waitresses, waiting to see if anything else was needed. Her heart had been pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard, but her face remained calm, her posture relaxed. The strychnine took approximately 15 to 20 minutes to begin showing effects. Sophie had known this from her research, had prepared herself for the wait. She had continued to serve, to pour wine, to clear the empty plates as the officers finished their venison. They had all eaten heartily, consuming every bit of the poisoned sauce. Now it was just a matter of time. The first sign had been subtle. One of the younger officers, a captain, had paused mid-sentence, his hand going to his stomach. He had frowned, looking confused, then had continued speaking. But a moment later, another officer had done the same thing, and then another. Within minutes, the entire table was showing signs of distress, grimaces of pain, hands clutching at abdomens, faces beginning to flush and sweat. Standard and for Richter had stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "Something's wrong," he had said, his voice tight with pain. "The food—" He hadn't finished the sentence. The convulsions had started then, violent spasms that threw him backward. Around the table, the other officers had begun to seize as well, their bodies jerking uncontrollably, their faces contorting in agony. The sound was terrible, gasping, choking, the crash of chairs and dishes as men fell to the floor. Sophie had stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with mixture horror and grim satisfaction. This was what she had planned, what she had worked toward, but the reality of it was more visceral than she had imagined. These were men dying in front of her, their bodies betraying them, their power and arrogance stripped away in moments of helpless suffering. The other waitresses had begun screaming, running from a room in panic. Martin had burst in from the kitchen, his face white with shock. "What's happening? What did you do?" But Sophie had remained calm. "Get out," she had said quietly. "Get out now and don't come back. Tell everyone the food was poisoned, that it must have been sabotage. Go." Martin had stared at her for a moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. Then he had fled. Sophie had turned back to the dining room, watching as the officers continued to convulse, their movements becoming weaker as the poison did its work. Some were already still, their eyes open and unseeing. Others were in the final stages, their breathing labored and irregular. Standard and for Richter had been one of the last to die. He had managed to crawl toward the door, his hand reaching out as if he could somehow escape what was happening to him. His eyes had found Sophie, standing in the corner, and in that moment she had seen recognition, not of who she was, but of what she had done. He had tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound had emerged. Then his body had gone rigid one final time, and he had collapsed. 15 minutes after the first symptoms appeared, all 15 officers were dead. Sophie had stood in the silent dining room, surrounded by the bodies of her enemies, and felt nothing. No triumph, no remorse, just a vast emptiness. She had done what she set out to do. She had struck a blow that would resonate far beyond this room. But the cost, the weight of 15 deaths, however justified, settled over her like a physical burden. She had known she needed to leave immediately. The alarm would be raised soon, and when it was, the Germans would tear Amsterdam apart looking for whoever was responsible. She had removed her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on a chair. Then she had walked out of Goudenloo for the last time, into the spring evening where the tulips still bloomed and the canals still reflected the gable houses, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The news of the poisoning spread through Amsterdam like wildfire. By the next morning, the entire city knew that 15 high-ranking German officers had been killed in a single coordinated attack. The resistance had immediately claimed responsibility, distributing leaflets that framed the operation as a legitimate military action against enemy commanders. The leaflets had been carefully worded to emphasize that only military targets had been affected, that no Dutch civilians had been harmed, that this was an act of war against an occupying force. The German response had been swift and brutal, but not as catastrophic as some had feared. They had executed 20 Dutch prisoners in reprisal, a horrific act but far fewer than the hundreds that some had predicted. They had imposed a curfew, conducted raids, arrested suspected resistance members. But they had also been thrown into disarray by the loss of so much of their command structure. The new officers who were brought in to replace the dead were cautious, paranoid, less effective. The occupation machinery, which had run with such terrible efficiency, began to show cracks. Sophie had gone underground immediately after the operation, hidden by the resistance in a series of safe houses throughout the city, and then eventually smuggled out of Amsterdam entirely. She had spent the remainder of the war in hiding, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to be traced. She had continued to work with the resistance in various capacities, but never again in such a direct operational role. The poisoning at the Goudenloh had made her too valuable, too recognizable, too much of a target. The psychological impact of the operation had been enormous. For the Dutch people, it had been a moment of hope, proof that the occupiers were not invincible, that resistance was possible and could be effective. For the Germans, it had been a shock, a demonstration that they were vulnerable even in their moments of celebration, that the people they dismissed as inferior and defeated could strike at them with devastating precision. The story had spread throughout the occupied territories, becoming a legend, a tale told in whispers of the Waitress who had poisoned an entire command staff. After the war, when the Netherlands was liberated and the full extent of the occupation's horrors became known, Sophie's actions were viewed through different lenses by different people. Some saw her as a hero, a woman who had done what was necessary in impossible circumstances. Others were more ambivalent, troubled by the violence of her methods, by the deaths she had caused, even if those deaths were of enemy soldiers. Sophie herself never spoke publicly about what she had done. She had returned to Amsterdam after liberation, had tried to rebuild a life from the ruins of what the war had taken from her. She never returned to teaching. The innocence required for that profession had been burned away by the war, by the things she had seen and done. Instead, she had worked in various administrative positions, living quietly, avoiding attention. She never married, never had children. The future she had imagined with Peter had died with him, and she had never been able to envision a different one. In the rare interviews she gave late in her life, Sophie was asked repeatedly about the poisoning, about whether she regretted it, about how she lived with the knowledge of what she had done. Her answer was always the same, delivered in a quiet voice that carried the weight of decades. I did what I believed was necessary. Those men were responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people. They were the machinery of genocide and oppression. If I had the chance to do it again, knowing everything I know now, I would make the same choice. But that doesn't mean I don't carry the weight of it. I carry it every day. She died in 1998, at the age of 82, in a small apartment overlooking one of Amsterdam's canals. She was buried in a simple ceremony attended by a handful of aging resistance veterans who remembered what she had done, who understood the impossible choices that war had forced upon ordinary people. The restaurant, the Goudenloh, never reopened after the poisoning. The building stood empty for years, a ghost of its former self, before finally being demolished in the 1960s. A small plaque now marks the spot, commemorating the resistance operation that took place there, though it doesn't mention Sophie by name. She had requested that, had wanted to remain anonymous even in death. But her story deserves to be told, deserves to be remembered not as a simple tale of heroism, but as a complex examination of what war does to people, of the impossible choices it forces, of the weight that those choices carry. Sophie van der Burg was not a soldier in any traditional sense. She had no training, no weapons, no support from any military organization. She was a schoolteacher who became a waitress, who became an assassin, driven by grief and rage, and a desperate need to strike back against an enemy that had taken everything from her. The SS officers who dined at the Gowden had dismissed her as just a waitress, had treated her as invisible, as insignificant, as beneath their notice. That dismissal had been their fatal mistake. They had failed to see that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who appear harmless, that invisibility can be a weapon, that underestimation can be lethal. Sophie's story is a reminder that resistance takes many forms. Not all acts of defiance involve guns or bombs or dramatic gestures. Some involve patience and planning, and the willingness to do terrible things for what you believe is a greater good. Some involve using the enemy's own prejudices and assumptions against them, turning their contempt into a vulnerability. It's also a reminder of the moral complexity of war, of the way it forces people into situations where there are no good choices, only choices between different kinds of terrible. Sophie killed 15 men, and those deaths saved lives by disrupting the occupation's command structure, by providing hope to a defeated population, by demonstrating that resistance was possible. But those 15 deaths were still deaths, still human beings who died in agony, and Sophie carried the weight of that for the rest of her life. There's a tendency, when we tell stories about World War II, to make them simple, to divide the world into heroes and villains, to celebrate acts of resistance without examining their costs, to forget that the people who fought back were ordinary humans thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Sophie's story resists that simplification. She was neither a saint nor a monster. She was a woman who lost everything, who found herself in a position to strike back, and who made a choice that she believed was necessary even knowing the burden it would place on her soul. The tulips still bloom in the fields outside Amsterdam every spring, just as they did in 1943. The canals still reflect the gabled houses. The bicycles still fill the streets. The city still lives and breathes and remembers. And somewhere in that collective memory, in the stories passed down through generations, is the tale of a waitress who was dismissed as insignificant, who was treated as invisible, and who used that invisibility to strike a blow that echoed through the war. When the SS officers sat down to dinner at the Gowden that March evening, they had no idea that the woman serving their wine, clearing their plates, standing quietly in the corner, was the most dangerous person in the room. They had no idea that their contempt for her, their certainty of her insignificance, had blinded them to the threat she posed. They had no idea that the venison they were eating with such appreciation, the wine sauce they were praising, contained their deaths. They learned, in those final terrible minutes, what it meant to underestimate someone. They learned that power and rank and uniforms meant nothing when faced with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. They learned that the people they had dismissed as inferior, as defeated, as broken, still had the capacity to strike back with devastating effect. But by then it was too late. The poison was already in their systems, already doing its work, already ensuring that they would never leave that dining room alive. And Sophie van der Berg, just a waitress, stood and watched as the men who had destroyed her world died in front of her, victims of their own arrogance and her carefully planned vengeance. The story of that night has been told and retold over the decades, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always carrying the same essential truth, that in war, the most dangerous weapons are often the ones you never see coming, wielded by the people you never thought to fear, that invisibility can be power, that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all, and that sometimes justice comes not from armies or governments or grand military operations, but from a single person with the courage to act, the intelligence to plan, and the willingness to carry the weight of what they've done for the rest of their lives. Sophie van der Berg was just a waitress, until she wasn't, until she became something far more dangerous, far more effective, far more memorable than any of the officers she served could have imagined. And in doing so, she proved that in the darkest times, resistance can come from the most unexpected places, carried out by the most unlikely people, with consequences that echo long after the last shot has been fired and the last battle has been fought.